This video is brought to you by TradeTitan Insights. When Donald Trump was re-elected to the White House for a second term in November, it was an unprecedented victory. Trump became the first United States president since 1892 to be elected to a non-consecutive second term, and the first Republican ever to do so. He was also surprisingly popular. Despite a long history of well-documented controversies, Trump came into office with a positive net approval rating, and his numbers were in a better place than they were in his first term. But now, after 3 months in office, several recent polls suggest that Trump 2.0 is rapidly losing support and is now less popular than he was in his first term. So in this video, we'll dive into the latest survey data, look at Trump's polling on the economy specifically, try to explain why Trump 2.0 is even more unpopular than Trump 1.0. Never miss an episode and always stay in the loop by subscribing and ringing the bell. So let's get straight into the data. Trump's falling approval ratings. When he came into office, Trump's approval numbers were actually pretty good. He had a net positive approval rating, meaning more Americans approved of him than disapproved, and he was more popular than he had been in his first term. His approval ratings trended slowly downward over the first few months of his presidency, but this is pretty common. Presidential approval ratings often fall after the so-called honeymoon period, and the decline wasn't too dramatic. However, a slew of polls published in the past couple of days suggest that Trump's approval ratings are now plummeting. The most recent YouGov poll showed that while 41% of Americans approve of Trump's presidency, a majority of 54% now disapprove, implying a net approval rating of -13, with especially bad numbers among young voters. Pew polling released on Wednesday was even more damning, giving Trump a net approval rating of -19. Even the most recent Fox News poll puts Trump at -11, down 9 points from last month, the worst of any president at this point in their term. Trump's economic approval is collapsing. Trump's polling gets even worse when you look at the economy specifically. Trump 2.0 is polling significantly worse than Trump 1.0 on the economy, with Trump's net economic approval having hit its lowest point ever. An Economist YouGov poll released earlier this week showed Trump's net approval on the economy having fallen to -12, a 24-point collapse since January, and well below the lowest levels of Trump's first term. Moreover, 52% of Americans think the United States economy is getting worse under Trump 2.0, up from 37% after Trump's inauguration. That said, the share who think it's getting better also increased from 19% in late January to 25% in mid-April. It's interesting that both trend lines, getting worse and getting better, are rising at the same time. As history and logic suggest, you'd expect one to fall when the other rises. This could be a symptom of just how polarized the American electorate has become. For context, as the Financial Times data journalist John Byrne Murdoch has highlighted, Americans are becoming more divided on the economy, with Republican voters generally thinking it's doing well when their party's in office and vice versa. The United States is unlike other countries here. In Western Europe, for instance, there tends to be a consensus on the economy's performance, even between voters of different parties. Nonetheless, consumer confidence in the United States economy now is also lower than at any point during Trump's first term, with even Republicans less optimistic about the economy under Trump 2.0 than at any point during Trump's first term, apart from his election loss in December 2020. Why is this happening? This is in large part because Trump's policies this time around, namely his global tariffs and sweeping cuts to federal spending, have been far more disruptive than people expected. For example, despite Trump's emphasis during the campaign on inflation and high prices, his tariffs look likely to increase prices in the short term, assuming he actually keeps them in place. The inflationary risks could be exacerbated further if Trump somehow forces the Federal Reserve to cut interest rates at the same time. Trump's tariffs and the damage they have done to business and consumer confidence have led the International Monetary Fund to predict a significant slowdown for the United States economy in its report this week, giving it a 40% chance of recession, cutting its growth forecast from 2.7% to 1.8%, the biggest downgrade for any advanced economy. Trump's tariffs and the uncertainty surrounding them have also tanked the stock market, with the S&P 500 down about 10% from its January peak. Unsurprisingly, this prospective combination of weak growth and high inflation isn't popular with voters. Polls suggest 48% of Americans think Trump's tariffs are overall harmful to the United States economy, compared to 38% who think they're overall helpful. The partisan divide is astounding. 86% of Democrats versus 14% of Republicans think Trump's tariffs will harm the United States economy in the long term. 74% of Republicans versus 9% of Democrats think tariffs will help the economy. This is why, according to data journalists G. Elliot Morris and Adam Carlson, Trump's net approval ratings on trade and inflation have fallen to -15 and -18, respectively, with immigration apparently the only area where Trump had a net positive approval, +5s, last week. Democrats like Gavin Newsom were cautioning against focusing too heavily on immigration and the Abner Garcia case specifically, because they thought it would be more politically effective to zero in on the economy. However, the most recent polls from earlier this week suggest that Trump is now in the red even on immigration. A Reuters Ipsos poll published on Tuesday found that Trump had a net approval rating of -1 on immigration. A YouGov poll published at roughly the same time put it at -5, a 10-point drop in just a week. This is sort of unsurprising. While voters were generally positive about Trump's immigration policies, they were always less supportive of specific policies. Polling from late March, for instance, found that unsurprisingly only 26% of voters support deporting immigrants to Salvadoran jails without due process, compared to 61% who don't. There are echoes of Trump's first term here, when his hardline position on immigration backfired electorally once the media started focusing specifically on his family separation policy, which was generally unpopular. Perhaps the silver lining for Trump is that, somehow, Democrats are still less popular than Republicans at the moment, with congressional Democrats looking at a net favorability of -23. Nonetheless, the trajectory clearly isn't good for Trump here, and he'll hope things at least begin to turn around before the 2026 midterms. Media bias in reporting Trump's decline. There's a lot to unpack here, with this story reported on by more than 72 sources. Interestingly, we can see that 29% came from left-leaning outlets. 31% came from right-leaning outlets. Looking at the headlines, you can also see that left-leaning outlets tend to describe Trump's polling decline with more dramatic language. For example, Trump bleeding support, Americans sour on Trump. Right-leaning outlets tend to describe it in softer terms. For example, Trump's popularity slumps, Trump losing ground, Americans not loving Trump's economic agenda. We're able to do that because of our sponsor, Ground News, whose incredible website and app lets you discover the news and pull back the curtain on media bias. Built by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. Ground ingests over 50,000 articles from all over the world and organizes them by story.